Hi, Brandi. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for having me.
Oh, we're delighted to have you. Can we start by me asking you just to introduce yourselves to our listeners, and would you say a little bit about your work as well?
Sure. My name is Brandi Adams, and I am an undergraduate program coordinator at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Just so that you understand what a program coordinator does, is that I help undergraduates sort of pick their courses, think about research, and I do this in the electrical engineering and computer science department. And I've been there for just under a year. I also do research in early modern plays, so plays between the 1560s and the 1630s. And what I'm really interested in investigating is the history of reading and the history of the book inside of those plays. But I'm really interested in plays that are written by authors other than Shakespeare. And I usually get a reaction because most people think that everything should be centered on Shakespeare, as he's one of our most important literary figures. But I disagree. I think that we can find out a lot about the history of reading and the history of books that you can't find by going to libraries that have archives of material. We can find really interesting stories about books and readers inside of the plays. And surprisingly, a lot of them are inside of plays that aren't written by Shakespeare. And another surprising thing about looking for these histories is that most of the reading and the books and the libraries that appear in plays also appear in universities and plays. And I think that right now, since a lot of universities are trying to adjust and figure out how they're going to educate their students, there are a lot of parallel questions that come up while reading these plays again. I'm interested in anonymous playwrights like Robert Greene, and I think that there's a lot that students and other scholars and the general public can learn about writers other than Shakespeare.
That's amazing. Thank you very much. There's tons to unpack there. I guess I'm thinking about listeners who may be engaging with some of these questions for the first time. And so I just wanted to check with you, when you talk about the history of reading and the history of books inside those plays, what does that mean and what does that look like? Just to make sure I've understood that.
Sure. So I guess what I'll do is kind of differentiate between what some historians who are practitioners of history of the book think about. So they may take a book as a physical object and they may look at marginalia, they may think about printing, they may think about who were the people who published the books and how they did that, how books were sold,
And
how readers...
just to clarify, marginalia...
Oh, yes, and marginalia is handwriting or doodles or exciting things that you find around the pages of a printed book or a printed sheet of paper. And what I'm looking for essentially is the same thing, but in a fictionalized way. So how people talk about books and how they think about books inside the world of a play. And how do characters react to their reading? Sometimes they even talk about writing margin notes. What does that mean? And how these people, these characters, conceive of what it means to be a reader during that time.
Great, thank you. I don't know if it's helpful to put an example into the mix, but I think about Julius Caesar in the Shakespeare play Julius Caesar, warning Brutus that he should be suspicious of this guy called Cassius. And, you know, Caesar's suspicion is well placed because Cassius is going to help get Caesar stabbed to death soon. But Caesar says he reads much, so that's very suspicious. He reads much. And also,
Indeed.
He loves no plays as thou dost. So this idea that if you like plays, you're cool, but if you read anything, you are dangerous and scary. And I always wonder what that feels like if you're hearing that in the theatre, as opposed to if you're reading that in a book when the play gets printed. You have a kind of different relationship with that. Is that the sort of thing you're thinking about in terms of histories of reading within a play? Or maybe not.
Yes, that's definitely part of it. what that could be part of it, the relationship between the reader who's actually reading the play. Uh, Ben Jonson is kind of famous for playing with that in plays where he has characters read plays and talk about seeing plays at the same time, which is always pretty exciting because I'm also interested in the printed play. So if I get to see characters read a printed play, then it's just this really exciting moment. Some people would say it's meta theater, or sort of something that's above the actual sort of goings on of the moment in a performance. But yes, to answer your question, that's part of it. And then I'm also interested in what people do with books, whether they burn them or drown them or throw them over their shoulder or think of them as their friends or their closest companions, or if they sort of orient their whole lives around books. And I would be remiss if I didn't plug my favorite non-Shakespearean play of all time, which is called the Parnassus Plays. And these are 3 plays that were written in the late 16th to early 17th century, and they take place in and around Cambridge University. And it's about students and their relationship with learning, books, reading, and how it has both come to define their lives and also brought them great disappointment. And I can see how a lot of students right now can feel that way because they are sort of in this middle ground where they're at home and they're learning, and something that could bring you great joy, the books that you read, the conversations that you have, but you're also in this liminal space where you're not really in the environment they're used to being in, and you're trying to adapt and cope. And I think that the characters in the play talk about books and talk about their relationships to books as a way to understand the world. And I think that this is a good time to think about that as well.
Great, thank you. It's also quite a meta version of these YouTube videos, because here we are running a series about books and about reading. And, you know, this box that you and I are speaking through now has kind of become the leading genre of our time, hasn't it? All news has been conducted through this. And of course, we're always framed, almost always we're framed by the books in our own lives. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's lots going on there. Thank you. And then you talked about the fact that Shakespeare usually ends up as a sort of center. You and I both have quite strong views about this, of course.
Me too.
What should I ask you now? Should I ask you about why Shakespeare is the center, or whether you have an alternative center, or how you feel about his centrality and what it does to other kinds of writing? Feel free to answer any, all, or none of those questions.
Okay. I'll try to do my best to answer as much of it as I can. Shakespeare as a center. I think that for a lot of people, Shakespeare is so central to the study of early modern literature that it becomes this overwhelming presence that sometimes can make your general understanding of the historical moment a little bit more difficult. You're looking at one, or there would be people who say that no play is written by one person. It's a collaborative act, but it's represented by one person. And having that person be the only central figure that scholars or undergraduates or high school students think about, to me is really, it really limits the scope of the world. And I think that students and I have really benefited from taking a look at other writers. I became much less intimidated by the study of Shakespeare once I started studying other playwrights. I found that I was less sort of I guess intimidated is the right word, because there's so much scholarship and so many brilliant people have written about Shakespeare, and they've certainly written about these other playwrights, but it seemed like there was space for me to think about about early modern history, about book history, about all kinds of things, where when I think of trying to cram in my own ideas to this sort of ocean of Shakespeare scholarship, it's kind of daunting. So I think part of it is just to open up the field to a bunch of different people and to kind of get some other perspectives. So Shakespeare, when you think about Shakespeare in the book, you think about, definitely Julius Caesar, you think about The Tempest, you think about, you know, some people will talk about some of the like Henry's, where books might appear here and there. A lot of people like to talk about Richard II and like the Mirror book, but I think that I'm also just interested in the daily use of books, like what people did, how they stacked them in the corner of their rooms. And a lot of the other plays demonstrate that. And I think that that's a good way to sort of enter into a larger scholarly conversation.
Great.
So,
Thank you.
yeah.
So, you've spoken really powerfully there about how Shakespeare's kind of come to stand for a wider historical moment. The way I often think about it is that he's kind of come to stand for, but also in the way of the people around him. And that brings us on to a kind of a wider, perhaps ethical or political point. And it's true of the whole period in general, isn't it? That this is an early period in English colonization, but some of the literary work and the cultural work being done at this historical moment ends up being weaponized effectively culturally in the later British Empire. And Shakespeare is only one part of that, but is quite an important part of that. And I also think of your work as pointing us towards some of the ethical problems there around diversity and the lack thereof in Shakespeare's work, how it is read and how it is edited and performed. I don't know if you want to tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. I think that for the longest time, there's been a resistance to having people who are considered outsiders read and think about Shakespeare, and I would add other playwrights. What does an early modernist look like, or what does a Shakespearean look like? They're more likely to think of you, Andy, than they are to think of me. And I think that there are some really wonderful scholars out there right now who have been persistently asking these questions, not just, I consider them my academic heroes. And they include people like Kim Hall, Umbereen Dadaboy, Ian Smith, just really great people who are thinking about questions that have to do with race and inside of Shakespeare plays, outside of Shakespeare plays and other plays. And they think about not just within the plays themselves, but in the place of Shakespeare studies and who gets to participate in this work. There are other scholars, including Ayanna Thompson, who is right now at Arizona State University, and she has just spearheaded this sort of revolutionary approach to thinking about race and Shakespeare. So there's conferences, and there are just really brilliant people who are out there doing work. And I would be completely remiss if I didn't mention Margot Hendricks, who is, I think of as one of the founders of folks who are asking these very questions that are extremely important. And I've been fortunate enough to have great conversations with all of these people. And I've noticed that it ends up intersecting with my own interest in the history of the book and the history of reading and who we focus on and who we think about. I've always been the type of reader who looks at the margins of things. So I always look for characters and moments that other people may not be as interested in, maybe partially because I have always thought of myself as a slightly marginalized reader. So I want to care about a character who maybe gets 7 lines as opposed to enjoying sort of a full play written about them. And I think that a lot of these scholars do the same things. And I find that my interest in reading and the history of reading and books inside of plays, a lot of the moments that I'm looking for are things that are pushed to the margins.
Yeah.
Things that are like a note, kind of like a note that you write in the side of your book, like marginalia. So I think like the characters and the things I'm interested in could be considered marginal. And what I'm trying to do is I'm really interested in pushing them more towards the center so more people think about them.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I love that idea of pushing things that are have been centered to the side and the things that are on the side to the center. I think it's wonderful. And I'm hoping that will be a big strand of some of the work that we do across these videos. I'm really grateful to you for the shout outs to various Shakespearean race scholars that you've given. And you've kind of given us, I mean, that's definitely a wish list of people we hope to speak to in the future.
Absolutely.
And if anyone's listening to this and is interested in following it up, you probably have better suggestions for this than me, but if people are on Twitter, a really good way of tracking down scholars doing excellent work in this field is the hashtag #ShakeRace. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. We've been ending these videos by asking people a super broad and general question, and you're welcome to interpret it in any way you wish. But the question is what the word literature means to you, whether it has a particular significance for you. Is it a word you find useful or unuseful? Does it get in the way of some of the things you're talking about around centering and decentering certain kinds of texts? Yeah, what does that word mean to you?
So, can I start with a small story?
Of course. Please do.
I studied abroad at the University of Lancaster University. So hello to everybody there. And I had a lecture in which a faculty member kind of put up a picture of a soup can, and asked us all this question: is this literature? And the whole sort of audience of students kind of froze. And I wasn't sure if I was in the right class. I didn't really know how to react. And then the professor then sort of backed down a little bit and said, well, can we talk about this? What about if we think about it as a text? And that helped me a little bit. And when you ask me sort of what do I use the word literature? What is literature? And I think sometimes I end up freezing a little bit when I think about what that word might mean. And then I think I have the same moment that I did when I was 20. And then I started thinking, well, it can be so many different things to so many different people. And I think that one of the things that I'm really interested in doing is taking sort of the term that people think of when you say literature, and you think that it's this very specialized type of book for a very specialized type of person to study. I want to explode that. I want everybody to be able to realize that they have something smart to say about any kind of book, about any kind of play, about any kind of text. And I think that that's a way to open up what I think traditionally has been a rather closed off field, to talk to your colleagues in other departments and ask, what do you think the word literature means? Because I have friends who are in computer science, and when I ask them, sometimes they're like, oh, that's what you study. I read these other books. And then I have to explain to them that, no, that's not the case at all. We all get to experience literature, and we all get to have a place to define it. Yep. And that's what I want. So I want all kinds of students and all kinds of people in general just to understand that they can be a part of it. So I think it should be a more inclusive term that doesn't just mean books that were produced in a particular time or place, or for authors who have this sort of exalted kind of, I don't know, place in the community. I think that what I would like to do is just to open up the conversation even more and just keep asking other people what it is. And
Yeah.
yeah. So I think that's it.
No, that's great. Yeah, that issue of specialization, I think, is, and the idea of something being put on a pedestal and therefore kind of away from ordinary people is really important. In the third video for this series, I talked about whether literature was just at the level of itself as a word, whether it implies exclusion in all kinds of different ways.
Yes.
And we've actually got a video coming up in the next couple of weeks. You mentioned Lancaster University. One of the academics there, Liz Oakley-Brown, will be joining Callan Davis, talking also with Michael Lewis about the relationship between literature and stuff and things and objects. And they end up talking about whether objects can function as literature in the way that you were just describing.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if Liz might have been part of the behind the lecture you're talking about.
She might have been.
So this will all tie up really beautifully. So that's just perfect. Brandi, this has been so much fun, super informative. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. I had a wonderful time.
Thank you.
And good luck for the rest of your series.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right.
Take care.
Okay, take care.